Awesome, and thank you for being here. And always love talk about DevRel and product. And one of the passions of myself, what I always believe in is how do you think about the right metrics dependent on the team that you're on and the product goals. And this is really dependent on where DevRel sits. Sometimes within the marketing team, sometimes within the product team or engineering itself. And when you see DevRel, it's really more cross-functional than that. And you're thinking about developer experience and how do you make sure that those metrics are aligned for what DevRel cares about and what DevRel should be demonstrating value to the organization versus what marketing or some other areas are focusing on. So just before jumping into things, a quick overview of myself. I'm the CEO of Mosaf, the API analytics company. I love discussing API strategy, platform growth, and analytics. And a little known fact about myself, I love IPAs. So if you're in San Francisco, you can find myself drinking one in Zeitgeist. Sadly, it's a little rainy here, so can't do that today. But why we talk about metrics? A lot of the DevRel metrics you see today are very focused on top of the funnel. And this is just by nature of DevRel sometimes being born out of the marketing side of things. And so things like average read time, how many page views you have on various content pieces, how many plays you have, for different YouTube videos, or maybe it's how many folks are signing up and listening to a webinar. Metrics are great. However, the product team has very different goals, which is thinking about things like engagement, usage, and true adoption of the platform. And so speaking through these three things, this is what I'm going to speak on today, is adoption, engagement, and retention. If you go look at the product teams, usually their KPIs or OKRs are going to be tied to one of these three areas. Some folks might be focused on the adoption side. Some folks might be focused on the retention side, but it's always important to tie everything back to these three goals. And why does it matter? Well, getting developers to truly adopt the platform can be hard, right? It's one thing to have them, read through a blog post, but it's a whole different story for them to actually adopt and integrate your platform, whether that's an API or open source project, and they have to get started with it. They're always context switching. They don't trust non-technical people. That's why we love, within the DevRel communities to be more empathetic towards developers. But even if you're the most empathetic DevRel person out there, those engineers and other folks, they're focusing on other things. They have a roadmap. Their managers telling them to do this and that. So how do they have time to, play around and adopt your platform? In addition to that, there's other stakeholders that you now have to consider. So on one side, you have the developer adopting your API, they're checking out documentation, but then there's the engineering leadership, right? And what does engineering get out of it? Whether it's DevOps or some other areas, you have various business teams, engineering leaders, and they may care less about whether a developer is having a great experience or able to discover this content. What they do care about is the impact to the top line or bottom line of the company or the organization. So let's first walk through how do we truly understand product adoption. One of the things I always recommend is taking a look at your cross-platform funnel. We love talking about things like time to first hello world, time to first working app. In this case, what we're looking at is now that they signed up or that they viewed that blog page, how many folks actually end up signing up for this platform and then getting to that first hello world. That can mean making a first API call. It could mean, getting a open source project up and running. Maybe it's running a Docker image or something like that, but at least something that allows them to have a vested interest in moving forward with this project and spending more time there. They're also able to see some initial signs of value. And then there's the last step here, which is truly seeing value from the platform, whether that is deploying an integration. It could be getting a working app out there and say the App Store or something like that, where there's real users or real revenue coming in. Until you get to that point, you really don't have adoption yet. But what the tricky thing here too, though, is you're looking at two different platforms at the same time. On the left side here, which is the blue bars, that's what's happening within your marketing pages, blog pages, or any other top of funnel content that you have. What we're really trying to do is get people into the product itself, get their hands on the product. And that's the orange boxes here, which is what we always recommend tracking. And eventually, hopefully, can loop that back to the first page, which is how do you, drive that viral loop, right? So when you set up these funnels, like Time to First Hello World, one important thing is to also look at the volume of engagement, right? Because it's one thing to make one single curl command through, say, and hit an API. It's a whole different story to say, someone sent 100 text messages or did, 100 different payment transactions. And so in this case, what we're doing here is setting up a 3-stage funnel. Our first step is, signing up for the application. Second step is making the very first API call. So that's our Hello World example. Okay, so they're able to at least play around with Postman, or maybe they're able to, you have some interactive documentation that they're able to make that API call with. And then it's the green box, which is the main goal here, which is have they made over 100 payment transactions? And we can, of course, time box this or look at this in different ways. But again, the main goal here is the volume of activity. Just a quick tip here. If you don't see people get into that green box, you can always, add those in-app guidance, email guidance, just nudge them in the right direction. If they haven't made that first API call within a 7-day period, just let them know, what is the next step here? Because many times, a developer could be confused on what they should be doing. But let's walk through product engagement, which is the meat of, we start thinking about the usage of a platform. So how do you actually measure engagement? Well, one of the easiest ways, but usually a bad metric, is something called page views, right? That we're all tracking. You can see how many folks are either viewing the home page or maybe viewing particular app pages. But in reality, they could be logging in and not get any value out of it, right? Do they have data? Are they querying the API and getting good results? Have they even integrated or not, right? So we can get a little bit of a better metric here, which is weekly active tokens. In this case, at least we're tracking people who are fully integrated with the platform and getting some value out of it, right? They're not just going to your landing page. But then there's also another problem here, which is, especially within a developer tools space, a single developer might create 5 API tokens. There might be 100 API tokens, depending on how those go around. So if you're able to tie that back to, account or user or maybe an organization, that's really the main metric to be tracking engagement. How many weekly active users you have. And if you want to see this from an activity standpoint, you can even add additional layers such as weekly active users over monthly active users to see how many people are returning. Now, when it comes to the API itself, there are some other bad metrics that you can be tracking, and here's some recommendations. So it's one thing to be looking at API calls per minute, but what if you have a batch endpoint, right? So is it better for a developer to send 10 separate transactions or 10 separate API calls versus trying to batch that all together into one single transaction? Many times, the best developer experiences try to create one single API call for one single business transaction, even though there might be many different underlying steps to complete that transaction, right? Distilling it down to a transaction that's either made or not made, right? So many times API calls per minute is usually a bad metric. You may also have like health probes in there, failing calls, and a lot of other stuff. So how do you get a little better? Well, then tie it to the business transaction. In this case, if your SMS API, instead of tracking how many requests they're making, it's more about how many text messages are being sent through the API. If you're a payments API, how many payment transactions are made, right? But even then, that may not be the best metric, because you could have 20 different communication channels for a telecommunications platform. You have video, you have SMS, you have a voice, and then you also have how much are they actually sending, right? Is it $10 in payments, or is it $100 million of payments going through the API? And so the best metrics are if you're able to really dig into the breadth and the depth of usage of the API by your customers. In this case, how many different features are they using? Are they using both the SMS API and the voice API? Are they sending, doing 30-minute phone calls versus just 20-second test video clips or audio clips? And this might be dependent on the domain and industry that you're in. So here's a couple examples of how do you think about different business transactions. In the e-commerce platform, it might be the number of items listed or viewed with the platform. For a typical SaaS app, it might be number of integrations being used. Is it just one integration, or is it 20 different connectors or integrations? If you have a data API, thinking about things like match rate. Were they able to access that information in your database, or whether there's zero results, right? Maybe it just wasn't able to come in your database. For logistics API, it might be how long does it take to complete that shipment? Was it on time or not on time? Just because they place an order for a shipment, but then it's always late, that could be actually a pretty bad experience here and not really aligned to product success. One last thing here is you can start adding things like user attributes, truly understand who your customers are. It's one thing to see developers signing up for our platform. It's a whole different story to see, you have engineering leaders, you have, different, a wide variety of different backgrounds, whether it's senior versus junior engineers, trying to find, how did they discover your platform? Was it through, ads versus, attending a webinar, or some other activities that you did, on the marketing and DevRel side. Once you add all these pieces together, we can start formulating a better picture of engagement, with the platform, whether it's broken down by customer, demographics, that type of stuff. But more importantly, now we can start looking into what they actually did and were they successful. Example that I'm showing here, we can see, the unavailable, which is the red line, is actually quite high, and it's almost the same as available. So even though we're tracking, daily API users, we see that our true, what we consider an active user should be only half of what we're seeing here, right? Because we might want to remove the available and out of stock tables and only consider, folks who saw, item for sale as available as being successful. And to show it a little differently here, now we're able to even break that down by those customer demographics and truly see, who is seeing, success, which in this case, we're saying, available inventory for this e-commerce platform. One thing we recommend is start scoring your leads as they come in. And so this is what we call PQL scoring. Easy way to do this is just red, yellow, green. And usually 4 different criteria we recommend, but you can always adjust this based off of your company and your product. Number 1 is the different APIs and features. So that's going back to the breadth and depth of features. Number 2 is, how many transactions have they sent? Is it just one, or is it, thousands? Does it look like it's deployed to production or not? But then also there's the, after all, it's folks that are signing up for your platform. So is it the right person? What size of company do they work at? What industry are they in? And are they doing things like adding seats, adding users, adding licenses, especially if there's some type of UI component for your platform? And all 4 of these can be combined together to create some type of lead scoring. And notice that it's, looking at both what's happening with the product itself, along with who the person is, right? When you look at more traditional sales processes, many times you're only looking at the person without, considering, are they actually using the product? So last bit here is let's walk through product retention. In this case, we're looking at what users are doing and are they sticking around and actively using your product, right? So this is a little bit different than, subscription retention or revenue retention, which is just looking at the dollars and logo growth and churn. In this case, what we really care about are people coming back and actively using the API or the platform. When you build these retention curves, in this case, we're looking at a daily retention graph. So day 0 should always be at 100%, because in this case, anyone that, let's say, the first step here is signing into a platform. The second step is making an API call. We would hope that 100% of people are in that day 0. But then it's going to eventually taper down. Good retention curve is going to be roughly flat. It could even go up a little bit at the very end. So some people call that the smile retention curve. If this is always going down to 0, that might mean you have a leaky boat. So why spend more efforts on DevRel and webinars and acquisition when the product itself, is leaky. That may mean you need to focus more around the developer experience side of things, such as, confusing documentation, or maybe, your reference material, or your onboarding experience, right? Things that are, can be done within, that middle funnel stage versus just continuing to invest into, conferences and that. But we can also dig into these retention curves a little further, such as, which programming languages or SDKs, slice and dice by, versions of API that a customer might be using, or even things like the customer persona. Are they an engineer? Are they back-end versus front-end? Are they senior versus junior? Where do they live in the world? Do they work at a large company versus small company, and so on? Example of how we can leverage these retention curves. In this case, we're breaking it down by different programming languages. So the top one here, we see Node.js. We see that's actually a very healthy retention curve. Starts off at 100%, like I was mentioning earlier, but then it tapers around that 20 to 30% range, which is pretty good. Then if we go down to PHP in the red box here, we can see that actually drops down to 0% on day 2. So this implies something is wrong with PHP, whether the SDK itself is buggy, the documentation or something else is lacking. It may just require you to create some more content and tutorials and quick starts around PHP. But it does warrant some investment and focus there. Lastly, when it comes to DevRel, it's always great to share some of these insights and metrics directly with your customers. Try and make them successful, right? It's really important as a developer to feel that you're empowered to figure things, by yourself versus, always following that support ticket and trying to get help from someone else. Whether that's things like SOA and performance metrics, usage metrics, especially if you have some type of, pay-as-you-go or usage-based billing model, even things like logs, whether, if it's an API as a service, you might want to embed some API logs. If it's open source tool, if you're able to provide a way for them to, see when the project is initialized, or maybe a way to see the output there. One last tip that we usually see happening is, keep your customers informed, or keep your developers informed, especially things like quota limits, rate limits, errors with the API. You want to avoid, surprises as much as possible. And if you're able to pull in some of these other metrics around, spikes in usage, that can help, especially on the more developer relations and CSM efforts. There's one takeaway, optimize for product value. What are they actually doing with the platform? Are they integrated? How long did it take for them to integrate and get set up with the platform versus just page views by itself? Again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at page views, but it's always, should be taken within the context of the overall developer experience or product experience.